Greetings and welcome back to the Daily Bread Bible Study. We are looking at day 19. This is Sunday, January 19th, 2020 for Exodus chapters 11 through 13. We're continuing in the discussion of the 10 plagues. Last time we focused on 1 through 9 we focused on 2 through 9, and now we will focus on the 10th plague and the death of the firstborn of the Egyptians, and the Passover of the firstborn of the Israelites. So we will see that plague and talk about that. And then also we will talk about the events surrounding the plague that becomes one of the staples for the Jews, and that is the observance of the Festival of Unleavened Bread, or namely the celebration of the Passover. So we'll discuss that here in Exodus, and let's jump right into it. So starting with Exodus 11, chapter 2, we hear about this promise being fulfilled through Exodus 3:21 through 22, where it talks about that God will deliver the spoil of the Egyptians into the Israelites' hands, and they will take jewelry and get to go with it. And so again, we hear that promise restated as well. In verse 4, then we actually get to what Moses is going to share, the plan with Pharaoh about the death of the firstborn. So this will be God's final plague. This is death of the firstborn of those who are in Egypt. It says from the Pharaoh's house to those who are in prison. There, all of the firstborn will be struck down in Egypt. But the firstborn of the Israelites will be preserved, and God will pass over them from this plague. So picking it up in chapter 12, we hear that the Passover is the beginning of it all, as it says in verse 2 of chapter 12. It's the beginning of months for the Jewish calendar. And on the 10th of the month, the Jews are called to observe the Passover. So as it says in Exodus 12:3, tell the whole congregation of Israel that on the 10th of this month, they are to take a lamb for each family, a lamb for each household. So the Passover then becomes featuring this lamb, this paschal lamb as it's called, or Passover lamb. And for those who are Christians, you can think a lot about Jesus at this time. He is often called the Paschal Lamb. And Jesus' Last Supper with his disciples is a Seder meal, observing the Festival of Unleavened Bread. And Jesus' death and resurrection, we as Christians tie in so many connections of this lamb to Jesus, and Jesus being the sacrifice to end all sacrifice, the atoning sacrifice, the sacrifice in which God will essentially pass over our sins and not bring death upon us, but grant us life everlasting through Jesus. So there's a lot of similarities, but I'd like to just have that in the back of your mind as you're thinking about that, if you are familiar with Jesus' story as a Christian. So let's look at some of the requirements of the lamb as detailed in Exodus chapter 12. Starting at verse 4, it says, the lamb shall be divided in proportion to the number of people who eat of it. And saying that if the household is too small for a whole lamb, it can be shared between its neighbors and other Jewish households. I think this is important for us as Christians to think of Jesus' atoning sacrifice is any one of us, our sins and our claim on Jesus is too small for this whole lamb, for the whole lamb of Jesus. And so I kind of see it fitting that Jesus' death and resurrection implies all people, and that it covers the whole world in the sense that it is the God is way too big for us to be able to just take him all to ourselves. So I think that's a good point for that we have, celebrate that we are connected with all Christians and not try and disconnect and say that we are holy or than thou. This lamb shall be without blemish, as Jesus was without sin. It will be slaughtered on the 14th day at twilight. The blood will be placed upon the door frame, on the doorpost, on the two doorposts, and on the lintel. So over there, and across the top. In verse 13, it says, the Passover when I see is when you see the blood, and you will pass over the houses on which there is no blood on it. The destroyer will pass over it, as it says in verse 23, which I take to mean that God is not going to take any more blood from a house which has already made a sacrifice to God through that lamb, being given there at the Passover meal. So in some ways, if there is no blood already taken, God will require a sacrifice of the firstborn of that household. And the firstborn sacrifice, as we'll look at it coming up later in Exodus, when God institutes all these different rules and laws, is that we will see that the firstborn is very important, and giving the firstborn being dedicated to the Lord is very important too, so that everything that is the firstborn is implicated by God and something that we're called to give back. This also ties in with the sense of a tithe, and that's giving 10% of the first fruits that we receive. The gift that since we were slaves in Egypt, that we had nothing, and we came out of Egypt, and so everything we have is a gift from God. And so we need to be humble and remember what God has done in Egypt, the way that the plagues came upon us and spared us, and were able to grant to us the privilege that we have as people of faith and people who accept Moses as one of our ancestors and come from that lineage. We need to be able to say, keep that sense of gratitude for the ways in which God brings us out and gives us all that we have. And so then we're called to give back the first fruits and the firstborn and anything that's first back to the Lord. So it's a little tangent. Let's get back into it. The Passover lamb is also to be eaten that night with bitter herbs and with unleavened bread, because we're supposed to eat it quickly, as we'll see. Nothing raw or boiled, but it must be roasted in the fire with all its guts. Nothing is to be remained in the morning. If it does remain, burn it. And you shall eat it like this, like those who are preparing to flee Egypt, remembering that is in fact what will come during this section to the Israelites once the firstborn of Egypt are killed and the wailing goes out and Pharaoh says, "Get out. You will be called to flee that night." So make sure that your loins are girded, your shoes are on, your staff is in your hand, and you eat in a hurry. This is the Passover of the Lord. So we see that these writings are in a lot of ways meant for those who will observe this tradition later on, but it's also the instructions of the Israelites in that day and time too, that they will be called to go out in a hurry because Pharaoh is going to call them out. Just as we're focusing on the future, right, passing it on through the Jews and their traditions, a day of remembrance through your generations, and a perpetual ordinance. These words all come up over and over again in this section, talking about the festival of unleavened bread and the Passover, and reminding that this is a very identity-forming event, for Jews especially, for us people and Judeo-Christians who follow in this trend, that the Exodus is the most important story to focus on in the first 5 books of the the Old Testament. It is the most important story, the central story, the story of God's redemption, and it is the focal story for this whole time. So it's very important that we document it well and know what traditions we're called to observe with it and be very detailed about it. So we'll see that that for 7 days you're supposed to eat bread, but it'll have no leaven in it. And this is repeated once again here because it is very important. It's called the Festival of Unleavened Bread for a reason, that no leaven is supposed to be used in the baking of bread. And it's hard to observe and get the spirit of what it's like to connect with your ancestors who were slaves in Egypt if you're eating leavened bread. So, continuing on in verse 25, it says, remember how you got to the promised land, essentially. And here's what you tell your kids, starting in Exodus 12, 26 through 27. And when your children ask you, what do you mean by this observance? You shall say, it is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord. For he passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt, when he struck down the Egyptians, but spared our houses. So we see that it's very important. And those instructions guide well, but they're incomplete. And in fact, we get more instructions in verse 43 to try and clarify, those who are not a part of the Jewish tradition, those who are not Jews or of the Israelite heritage. It says, no foreigner shall eat of it, yet resident aliens can if they are circumcised. And circumcised slaves are okay to eat it, but you cannot have contracted slaves. They can take no part of it. Those who are paying off a debt but will be released, kind of like Jacob did to Laban, that he was paying off a debt. He would be that contracted servant versus somebody who is a perpetual slave, either taken through war or taken through other means. It'll be eaten in one house, and no part of it taken outside. No bones of the lamb will be broken. And that sounds very familiar to Jesus on the cross, where they explicitly state that they did not break his legs in order to fulfill this connection to the Passover lamb. All of Israel shall observe it. It will make you uniquely different, and it's a special observance, so keep it, along with what else makes you special as an Israelite is the mark of the covenant, which means you must be circumcised if you're a male in order to eat this as well. So let's continue on a little bit. So after we've talked about and extended all of these rules around this event, we actually get to the account in verse 29, where the 10th plague happens. And then Pharaoh pretty quickly in verse 31 says, go. Thus the mission of the 10 plagues has been accomplished, and Pharaoh has let God's people go out of slavery in Egypt. The Israelites are then encouraged to leave from the scared Egyptians. They ask them for gold and silver jewelry, as God had foretold. And then we see a record in verse 37 of chapter 12 that it says 600 men on foot besides children, along with what's called a mixed crowd, which my best guess is that those are the Egyptian wives and children who people have married while they've been slaves in Egypt and bring them out as part of their family as well too. Verse 39 it mentions again, they are carrying unleavened bread since the dough did not have time to get yeast, and they don't bring yeast or the flour supplies with them to have yeast. And then it says that they were slaves in Egypt for 430 years, which is a long, huge time. So it's probably closer to between 200, but probably closer to 300 years in which Joseph would not have been around. So after his time, and then at least 200 years after his memory is probably forgotten of this, slaves in Egypt. So anyways, chapter 13. We look at the consecration of the firstborn, and then we make the connection of the firstborn Passover to the festival of unleavened bread. Talking about there in we'll look at chapter 13, verses 12 and 13. God says, "All the firstborn of your livestock that are males shall be the Lord's, and every firstborn male among your children you shall redeem." So this includes livestock and animals, and also humans as well. And the firstborn you dedicate to the Lord. You can give that to the Lord. I'm not exactly sure if that means sacrifice specifically, or if that means dedicating it to the Levites, but I can look into that. "But every firstborn male among your children you shall redeem." This would be offering a sacrifice in their stead, just like in the ways in which they sacrificed the Paschal lamb, instead of God sacrificing the firstborn of the children of Israel, like the firstborn of the children of Egypt were sacrificed. So that's what I believe the redemption means, redeeming them. The importance of instructing your children in the traditions is to retain your identity before God and to honor the events that led to your freedom in the promised land. So it's funny because God keeps on saying, tell over and over, repeat this, and Moses and Aaron are saying, repeat this over and over again, tell this story. This is a central story. We must tell it over and over again. It's because the people, as we will see coming up, God will call them a stiff-necked people when they are in the wilderness. And God is cautious that the people will be rebellious, which is why we hear in verse 17 that he changes his route and his direction of where they will go. I think this is just speaking to leadership in general, that change is hard. And we as people have a slow time adapting to any changes, or being able to manage changes well is very important, because human fear is real and it leads to rebellion. And as we'll see with the Israelite people, the grumbling will continue and they will doubt Moses' leadership, but through it all, God will bless them. But that's more in the chapters following. So that's all I really have for today. And that was a lot. If you know anything else about observing the Passover, anything that I missed, me not being a Jew, I am not able to speak fully on what the practices of modern day Jews do. But I know, as somebody who claims this tradition as well and is a part of it, especially through Holy Communion that we have in Jesus' Last Supper, we give thanks that we are connected and are able to celebrate in that God brings people out of slavery, that God frees and releases us, and that God is one who atones for us and looks over our sins and our debts, and still wants to be connected with us. So I give thanks to God for that. And here ends our Daily Bread Bible study for today.